Welcome to Bottled Petrichor, a podcast dedicated to discussing key topics in Islamic history and thought. In addition to a short lecture at the start of most episodes, we ask our guest experts questions submitted by listeners and allow them to share their thoughts in a safe environment. Please visit our Twitter page for feedback and question submission forms. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy.
So, in Egypt, we probably have a sort of correlation between the Arabization of the region and the rate of conversion to Islam, particularly from Coptic Christianity. In other places, there is probably some correlation. We also can witness a decline of the Syriac language and a shift from a Syriac vernacular to a Syriac liturgical context. So the language Syriac, which is sort of cousin of Aramaic, which was the dialect that many Christians in areas of Syria and Iraq, particularly northern Iraq, were using as their sort of everyday language, changed from a vernacular to sort of a liturgical language associated with the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Syriac Church, and in some cases the Church of the East. And we see this shift happening over the course of several centuries, so that by the end of the 13th century, Syriac is we find very, very few records of Syriac after the 13th century. It seems to be used as a written language regularly only until that point, and it starts declining significantly as of the 9th century. And so this also sort of reflects in some ways Egypt's shift. Coptic first stops being used as a vernacular language and is reduced only to a liturgical language, and then after that becomes much less frequently used. Excuse me. So what we can say is that the area is mostly Muslim by the time the Crusaders arrive. We know, or at least from what we can tell, by the 11th, 12th centuries Common Era, so roughly the 5th-ish century history, the area is, by any sort of accounts, and this is sort of usually sort of passing observations, the area is majority Muslim. And in cases where you do have Christians, you have minorities in the cities, and then you have sort of villages here and there where the entire village or the entire sort of local community has decided either to remain Christian or has decided to convert en masse. And often these are sort of groups that are practicing sometimes their own sort of non-standard or non-orthodox form of Christianity, even by the standards of very sort of Eastern Christian sects, and sometimes with Muslim or Islamic elements sort of brought into worship. And so you do see these sort of, in very rural areas, almost like the sort of hybrid religion. And of course this horrifies both Muslim authorities and Christian authorities, right? But we do have some evidence of it. And when, people from outside the village come in and see what these people are doing, they immediately tell them, no, you're practicing our religion wrong. Here's how you do this properly, right? So we see a very mixed bag. But certainly by the end of the sort of early medieval period, by the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, we have probably a majority, if in the 11th century, like just barely a majority, you have a majority of Muslims in the region by that point. But beyond that, we can't really tell what the rate is per se of conversion and how that changed during the early period.
In the earlier period, I understand why some people might convert, but later on, the years passed, were there different reasons to convert? I noticed that you had mentioned that a couple hundred years after these conquests, the rate of conversion, that's when it started to increase. And this is also the time where a lot of Islamic sciences are being standardized. Is there any relationship between the two?
I think so. I think by this point it is becoming much clearer to people what Islam is and what it requires of you, and sort of the beliefs that are a part of Islam that are very distinct from the beliefs of Judaism or Christianity. And so, you even see the emergence of interfaith debates, often held by the caliph or a local or a governor or an administrator, an emir, in which representatives from different religions will actually debate sort of whose religion is superior. And of course, non-Muslim participants in that debate had to be very careful about what they said, while also trying to argue on behalf of their religion. And sometimes you see conversions happening in these debates, which of course, their written form in the context that we have them is almost certainly very stylized, and may or may not actually represent a real debate. But you have cases where people in the audience will convert, usually to Islam, as a result of witnessing the debate. We also have cases where people have this sort of mystical experience that inspires them to convert, usually to Islam, sometimes in fewer cases to convert to Christianity from Islam, but usually, or to Judaism from Islam, but usually people have these sort of mystical experiences where they hear the Quran being spoken or being recited, and they sort of see a light or feel something very powerful within them, and that is their motivation. So we see increasing sort of accounts of religious motivations, purely religious motivations, for converting. But we also, it is also quite possible that, this shift from Islam as a minority religion to Islam as a majority religion happens as a result of sort of demographic change. Certainly, if you are a Jewish or Christian woman, you do not have to convert in order to marry a Muslim man, but your children, any children that you have, will be raised Muslim. So there's that demographic shift. The fact that Muslim men can have more than one wife, whereas Christian and Jewish men cannot, also, has an effect on the sort of changing demographics of the region. But certainly conversion is a powerful sort of change maker in terms of the religious makeup of the Middle East. So we do see more circumstances that are religious in terms of conversion. But again, not to be a cynic, but we can never really know what somebody's motivations are, and so religious experiences may or may not actually reflect what caused somebody to convert. Just like, if somebody say that social or economic advantage caused them to convert, there may also have been a religious motivation that was not advantageous to reveal, right? You never really know why somebody chooses to convert. But certainly we see a number of different types of conversions or conversion narratives emerging during this period.
And we're discussing languages. So what were the languages of the areas that the Muslims conquered? And then how did Arabic become a popular language? How did people learn Arabic?
Right. Okay. So at the onset of the Muslim conquest, Arabic was spoken, in the Arabian Peninsula mostly, although it certainly wasn't the only language spoken in the Arabian Peninsula. Our two major empires, the Byzantine Empire, the official language of the Byzantine Empire was Greek, but of course there were a number of regional languages that were spoken as a vernacular and sometimes liturgical language, and that would include, as I've mentioned, Coptic in Egypt. That would include Syriac in areas of the Levant and even in northern Iraq. We don't really get into the Anatolian Peninsula. The Anatolian Peninsula doesn't actually become Muslim until the 11th century Common Era, and so and in fact there is a border between the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire that is sort of continually bombarded during the Abassid era by these caliphs who are seeking to sort of expand into the Anatolian Peninsula. So Turkish is also not really. It becomes a language of some military groups, particularly military elites, during the Abbasid Caliphate, but for the most part, it is not a major language. Certainly during the early period, it is not really a major language. In the Sasanian Empire, Persian or Farsi was and continues to be the official language of most of that territory. Iraq now speaks Arabic, but Persian Arabic never replaced Persian or Farsi as the vernacular language in that region, ever. And we know this was partly due to an increased interest in Persian culture and Persian language and literature and poetry during the late Umayyad and particularly early Abbasid periods after that region had been conquered. Whereas during that same time period, in former Byzantine territories, Arabic was beginning to gain popularity due to the fact that it had been made the official language of the empire. So that we see different sort of effects of language in different regions. In terms of conversion, I mean, like I said, I think that there is a relationship between increased use of Arabic and outside of the context of the Sasanian Empire, former Sasanian Empire, and Persian-speaking regions. I think that there is a significant relationship between the increased use of Arabic and the expansion of the sort of Muslim population, or the increased rate of conversion from what we can tell in those areas. Once you become Muslim, I mean, there is really not any reason to continue using a language that is associated with the religion that you just left. Certainly, you would continue to use it if you were, say, a sole convert among your family. You would continue to use that language, but you might raise your children, with a focus on Arabic, right? And so, right, there is, so that's sort of the situation in the Caliphate, both prior to and then during the early Islamic period.
And so bilingualism was a thing then. I mean, a lot of people must have known multiple languages, and I mean, how quickly were they picking up these languages?
Sorry, say that last question again.
And how quickly were they picking up these languages, or Arabic?
Right. So I'll use Syria as an example. In the context of Syria, you might have people who were speaking Syriac as their vernacular, who also knew Greek as the official language of the empire. If they were living during the middle of the 7th century, then they saw the language of empire continue on as Greek after the Muslim conquest until the late 7th century, when it was suddenly switched to Arabic. But for those decades in the middle to sort of late 7th century, you often had bilingual documents. You had Greek documents, official documents, posted in both Greek and Arabic. And so bilingualism, or even trilingualism, was incredibly common. And people who wanted to join the administration or continue on it as in the administration would have to learn Arabic by default. And so it was very common for people to know 2 languages, 3 languages, or to acquire a 3rd language, or even more languages, especially if you traveled, in order to survive in that sort of social and political context. So, yeah, many people learned Arabic to advance their careers, and then this had an effect on sort of which languages increasingly became used, not only in sort of official contexts, but in unofficial ones as well.
Understood. And I'm moving on. The apocalyptic fervor that was, pretty strong and a driving force of a lot of the early conquests, at what point does it start to die down? I mean, you're starting to utilize the administrative structures of these empires. I mean, that's done so that you can create some type of lasting, you can, have a lasting presence in these areas. So really, at what point does this apocalyptic fervor die down?
Right. So there are a lot of different theories about this, and of course, apocalypticism never really ceases to exist. But it dies down after the early period. I'd say it dies down pretty evidently by the end of the 7th century Common Era, by the late 1st century Hijri. Certainly by the Umayyad period, by the middle of the Umayyad period, it sort of winds down a little bit. You don't see that being as much of a motivating factor, although it does emerge again with the rise of the Abbasids. A few decades into the Abbasid era, you see this massive uptick in apocalypticism that coincides with the year 200 Hijri. And this is also associated with a zeal to kind of move into the Anatolian Peninsula and take over Constantinople. But for the most part, in the early period, this dies down with the Umayyads. Of course, by this point, we have, an army that may or may not be sort of, or maintaining an army may or may not be an end unto itself in terms of the conquest, right? But it is a major factor during the Rashidun era, and possibly during the early Umayyad eras, and then I think it calms down after that.
Okay, because that can be good for business. I mean, if everyone's thinking that, the Day of Judgment is right around the corner.
Right.
In terms of administration, still, I mean, kind of the day-to-day things. I mean, was there like widespread chaos when these types of things were happening? Like, how exactly did this affect the average person?
Right. So, in the early period, of course, I've talked about I don't mean to paint a picture of early sort of Islamic society as totally chaotic, right? And the dark horse of the apocalypse is sort of running through the streets or anything like that. But there was quite a lot of confusion in terms of how things were run. And I think, I tend to identify the sort of major shift from sort of an early period in which people aren't really sure what this empire should be and, what it should look like, to a shift to a sort of fairly standard structure. I pinpoint this to Abdul Malik. Honestly, he is not the sole person responsible for the sort of standardization of the bureaucracy. Under the Caliphate, Abdul Malik reigned from 685 to 705, Common Era, and he did implement, though, a number of different reforms that standardized coinage. He implemented Arabic as the standard language of the administration. He sent out re-standardized a sort of review of the sort of standard script of the Quran and made sure that everybody, every major center of the Caliphate had a standardized Quran and sort of an officially sanctioned one, which reduced sort of the number of sort of variant readings. And he also was the one who implemented the census. So there wasn't an attempt to sort of clean up this chaos, right? And so I pinpoint this shift to him. And I think that this is also sort of, as these apocalyptic tensions are sort of dying down. But other scholars have argued the opposite, that he does so in part out of a concern that the apocalypse is imminent. And so, and that is partly why he builds the Dome of the Rock, et cetera, et cetera. But I think at this point, apocalypticism is sort of dying down as a popular movement. You do, again, like I said, see an uptick of it during the Abassid period. That coincides with the bringing in of Turkish horsemen into the military. And like I said, coincides with a sort of increased fervor for taking over the Anatolian Peninsula and sort of reaching Constantinople. But that's sort of a secondary concern. But that also is the start of this maybe increase in conversion. So, maybe there's something there that hasn't been examined yet. But, yeah.
And what about people who weren't Muslim? I mean, the people with whom the Muslims were, I guess, interacting. Did they ever see this as some type of sign of the apocalypse? That, you have a bunch of these people from, the deserts coming out to, raid and conquer us. How did this play into their own worldview?
Oh, yeah. So the early Islamic conquests were absolutely a sign of the apocalypse to non-Muslims. To people in, these territories that the Caliphate quickly expanded into. They absolutely see the Arabs as sort of the harbingers of the apocalypse during the 7th century. This is recorded throughout the Middle East. It's recorded in records from Egypt, from records from Syria, in records from Iraq and Iran. This is not a universal sentiment, but a fairly common one. Because otherwise, we've talked about the Sasanian Byzantine Wars now quite a bit, but, after seeing all of these wars happen for, at this point, it would have been generations of people. And so, then they sort of die down. Suddenly now there's these people coming from the south, can we tie this to, scriptural description? Can we tie this to sort of, religious understandings, our own religious understandings of what the apocalypse is supposed to be? Is this like the beast from the south or the sea, or how can we make sense of this? And often, the apocalypse is how people made sense of the early conquest.
So what was the relationship between the rulers and the ruled? I mean, was there any racism? And I know that's perhaps not the most appropriate term, but how did they view the people that they ruled? How did they view non-Muslims? How did Muslims view non-Muslims at this period? I mean, what was the day-to-day life like?
Okay, so for the most part, we are dealing with, the materials that we have that come from these time periods, which are, for the most part, historical documents, or to a lesser extent, maybe literary documents. But, we can't actually place ourselves there completely. So in terms of the way rulers viewed non-Muslims, this sort of depends on the time period. So in the conquest era, we certainly know that not only sort of declaring yourself Muslim, converting, if we can say that, but becoming a part of the movement had an effect on your social standing in ways beyond sort of what we've just talked about, converting after the empire, sort of the caliphate is in place. During the conquest period, how early you became a part of this new religious movement has a direct effect on your social standing, and it has a direct effect, particularly if you're in the army, on how much money you make. The diwan, the register of who was in the army and what they should be paid, was structured based on when somebody converted. So if you were from a tribe, or if you were from Mecca and you joined the movement early, went with Muhammad to Medina, fought in the Battle of Badr, you received one of the highest, if not the highest, sort of tier of salaries from the army. If you had converted after Mecca had been sort of reconquered in 630, but not particularly late, then maybe you were sort of in a middle tier, right? And if you were part of, say, one of the tribes that had been sort of staunchly Jewish or staunchly Christian, take for example the Kelb tribe, remained famously Christian for quite some time, and you had converted later, then your salary from the army would be much lower as a result. And so this had a sort of direct effect on your social standing. If you were, and for the most part during the conquest period, the early conquest period particularly, if you were part of the movement, you were Arab, right? With few exceptions, few famous exceptions. We know Salman al-Farisi was Persian, for example, etc. But for the most part, people who took part in the early Islamic conquest were Arabs. And when I say Arab, I mean somebody from the Arabian Peninsula, because that is, even itself, is sort of contested, right? The idea of sort of who is and is not an Arab has changed significantly over the course of the last several hundred, possibly thousands of years. Certainly the last 1,500 years, this has changed and has expanded. The idea of sort of who is an Arab today is very different from sort of who was an Arab during the early Islamic period. So if you are part of the early Islamic conquest, you are an Arab. If you converted when Muhammad was still preaching in Mecca, or maybe when he was in Medina, then you are rewarded basically financially for that. If you joined the movement during the conquest period and then during sort of the early Umayyad periods, and you joined on your own, which is to say you converted on your own, you were considered to be a mawla, which is to say a non-Muslim and sort of like a client. You would have a Muslim sort of almost like a patron who is sort of your role model or your mentor, and in some ways you might be sort of adopted into that person's tribe or that person's, maybe to a lesser extent, that person's family, but you were considered in a sort of clientage role, and this was sort of a secondary status, but nonetheless you were still a Muslim and granted all of the privileges that Muslims were granted. Eventually this sort of devolved into, particularly during the late Umayyad period, an understanding of sort of Arab supremacy. If you were an Arab, which is to say you were from a tribe from the Arabian Peninsula, then you were considered inherently sort of superior to groups, to people from other regions and people, regardless of whether they were Muslim or not. And this was partly what fueled the Abassid Revolution, particularly among Persians who felt that they were had been relegated to sort of a second-class status unjustly, right? Despite the fact that many of them had, there were many Persian converts who had joined the administration, who were used to being sort of elites maybe in society, and who were suddenly considered secondary to these Arabs in the Umayyad administration. And so this sort of fueled quite a lot of resentment. There were, of course, other, racism, you're right, is maybe not the right term to use in this context, but certainly there were understandings of sort of, or literary sort of, we have texts that sort of identify different people as sort of different races, people from different regions, and even sort of ascribing attributes to them. And so you do have sort of these racial distinctions and sort of tiers or sort of levels ascribed to different groups. And so this is sort of a concern. So rulers viewed both Muslims who converted later than perhaps they maybe should have or could have as sort of lesser than sort of early converts, particularly Arab converts, because these sort of things are correlated for the most part. If you are not living in the Arabian Peninsula, how could you convert to Islam, as early as somebody who was living in Mecca alongside Muhammad, right? And so, your sort of ethnic identity, and which was tied into your the language that you spoke, was also tied into your social standing by virtue of the fact that you weren't necessarily able to convert as soon as other people who had been exposed to the movement more earlier. And of course, anyone who had not converted was several tiers below that, right? They were second-class citizens, sometimes were even forced to wear clothing signifying that they were non-Muslim, and had various other restrictions placed on them, depending on sort of who was ruling and in what context. These weren't necessarily consistent. So yeah, there was certainly a social hierarchy related to who was Muslim, and that sort of correlated to ethnic identity. And in addition to this being sort of an administrative sort of view, this was sort of enshrined into caliphal administration. Certainly on the street you also had cases where we have evidence of Muslims sort of persecuting non-Muslims, evidence of non-Muslims trying to hide their identity. If they had to wear this special clothing, they would try to sort of cover it up. You even have cases sort of on the street of people forcibly or trying to sort of forcibly convert somebody. These are few and far between, but they certainly exist. And so when I say, there wasn't really forced conversion outside of these sort of Ridda wars and the early conquest inside the Arabian Peninsula, that's not entirely true, but systematically that's certainly not true. But we do have small instances of sort of persecution and attempts to sort of forcibly convert people. And this is, done by ordinary sort of people to ordinary people. And so it's certainly not officially sanctioned, but sanctioned. But we do have these sorts of cases. So there is a hierarchy, and it is tied to race, it is tied to ethnicity, it is tied to language, it is tied to religion, and then of course, your usual sort of factors of wealth and social standing and, gender, and sort of your status in a household, free or slave, et cetera, right?
Yeah, so pretty much satisfaction levels with the new conquerors that depended pretty much on who you were and
right.
Who was ruling at the time.
Very much so.
Now, this is something that we had mentioned earlier, but I kind of want to discuss it a bit further. But the designation Muslim, where does that come from, and how did the conquered people in their own sources refer to these conquering people? Were they referred to as Muslims or something else? And how did early Muslims refer to themselves?
Okay, so early Muslims refer to themselves, from what we can tell, often as mu'minun, which is to say believers, possibly the Quran uses mu'minun far more than it uses muslimun, or Muslim, which is to say a submitter, right? And in fact, there is a distinction in the Quran, a very sort of explicit one between Muslim and mu'min. You know, the Bedouins say, and I can't think of the Arabic right now, but the sort of English paraphrase version is the Bedouins say, you know, it's 49:14 through 15. The Bedouins say, you know, we believe, and the Quran admonishes them and say, you know, do not say we believe. To say we have submitted, because belief has not yet entered your hearts, right? And so this is sort of, the Quran itself makes this distinction between belief and submission, and sort of mu'min, believer, and Muslim, which is to say submitter. And so, and it of course refers to the followers of, or its audience as, or its believing audience as mu'minun more frequently than Muslimun, as I've said. We see among non-Muslim sources, we don't see the word Muslim used for a few decades after the conquest. We see a lot of different terms being used. We see Arabs being used. We see, to a lesser extent, Saracen being used. And then only in the late 7th century, and even more so in the early 8th century, do we see the word Muslim or some sort of variation of it start to be used. So the word Muslim sort of transferred into sort of Coptic or Greek or Syriac. And so, yeah, the word Muslim isn't, among Muslims themselves, I mean, part of the problem here is that many of the sources that we have from the Muslim period, with the exception of the Quran, there has been a historiographical sort of question over the origins of Islam for quite some time now, and certainly for the last, I would say, 50, 60 years or so, this has been a major debate in the field of Islamic studies. And so particularly in the 1970s, there were a number of scholars who basically rejected the entire sort of standard narrative, the standard understanding of Islamic history, because many of the sources that we do have in writing didn't exist in writing until maybe 100 to 150 years after the events that they purport to talk about. I mean, the Sirah of the Prophet, the life of the biography of the Prophet, by Ibn Ishaq, as redacted by his student Ibn Hisham. I mean, Ibn Ishaq was writing in the maybe 750s, and Ibn Hisham was redacting it, editing it in the 820s, I believe. And that is, you know, one of our earliest sources. We don't have very many sources from the Muslim perspective, with the exception, of course, the major exception of the Quran, from the period of the events that it purports to cover. The Quran itself was also brought into question for quite some time. In 2010, there was an article published by Behnam Sadeghi, which did some carbon dating of an early Quran from Yemen, which proved that it is we can relatively confidently say that it is probably from the time period in which the Quran was compiled and codified, which was under the reign of Uthman in the 650s. But we, so we can say with reasonable certainty that the Quran is from, or was compiled and written down and sort of, put into the form of a codex, in the form of a book, in the 650s, probably, which is what our sort of narrative understanding of, or understanding of sort of the text that we have. That's what our histories say. But many of our other sources come from much, much later. So there's a question of, how accurately these histories are conveying the events that they purport to convey. Went off on a tangent. All of that is to say that in terms of what Muslims were calling themselves, I mean, our evidence is from maybe 150 years at the earliest after the time period it's covering, and therefore, if there were changes in self-identification, if people were calling themselves mu'min in the early 7th century, and were calling themselves Muslim by the 8th or 9th centuries, then that shift might not actually be traced, because what is being written and edited and redacted in the 8th or even the early 9th centuries might actually reflect the norms of that time period better than some of the norms that existed during the 7th century. So in the case of Ibn Hisham redacting Ibn Ishaq, I mean, we know that some of his changes, a few of them, reflect a sort of shift in understanding of Islamic history from the 740s, 750s to the 820s. So in a lot of ways, we don't really know what Muslims were calling themselves. But our sources say that they were calling themselves Muslim, and they talked about their conversion in the context of Islam. Your conversion would be your submission, therefore your Islam, right? And there's less of a focus on sort of the idea of a believer as a sort of something that may or may not be totally distinct from a Christian or a Jew. As for non-Muslims, we do have earlier records, but they are still some decades as opposed to centuries later. And the earliest ones don't use the term Muslim at all. We start to see Muslim emerge, like I said, I think the first case I saw of it was maybe around 680, but I think that was even sort of a weird version of it. But for the most part, you don't see emergence of that term being used, or a variation of that term being used in Syriac or other languages until the 8th century. So we see Arab, we see Saracen, we see like Hagarenes, basically. We see a lot of strange terms, but we don't see Muslim for quite some time.
Understood. And I mean, this brings me to, I guess, the last cluster of questions that I had. Now, when writing history about, about early Islam, what do historians rely on? What is a documentary source and what is a narrative source? And what's more important when writing history?
Okay. Ideally, you would have multiple sources that were written by a contemporary witness to the events being covered, as well as archaeological evidence to corroborate it, or evidence from outside of a particular community to corroborate it. You would have multiple sources saying, the exact same thing or nearly the exact same thing, right? Or all indicating sort of one understanding of the events that happened. When we are dealing with, first of all, you never have ever two accounts that exactly corroborate one another, because everybody's point of view is slightly different. That's the case in the modern context, right? In the context of early Islam, we have, like I said, almost no sources from the time period of early Islam from the Muslim perspective. The sole exception is the Quran, and of course, what an exception it is, right? But the Quran itself does not necessarily, there is a lot in the Quran, but very little sort of history or sort of, discussion of what exactly is happening with this community. So we do have very little to go on. Most of our sources come from later time periods. And so I've talked about sort of, the fact that maybe they've been edited or the understanding of what happened during that period has shifted based on sort of an understanding of what Islam is and what Islam maybe used to be being somewhat different, slightly different, right? And so that is a question. In terms of narrative sources versus documentary sources, so a documentary source would be a source, I think you could interpret that in a few different ways, but I do want to talk about the importance of sort of transmitting stories and transmitting histories in particular, orally versus through text, through written text. And in the pre-Islamic and early Islamic context, you do see a prioritization of oral transmission of stories, which is to say histories, biographies, and plenty of other information besides, right? But those are some of the two that we're most concerned with. And so, this is due to a number of reasons. One has to do with the relative lack of writing materials, right? Paper does not come to the Middle East until the 9th century. So what you have to write on in pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia, for example, were, if you had quite a lot of money, you could import papyrus from Egypt, or you could, if you valued a written record and were willing to also spend quite a lot of money on it, you could use parchment, which is basically dried animal skins, but these would have been rare and very costly to produce. You also had animal bones, sort of shoulder bones of camels are sort of larger and relatively flatter, and could also serve as things to write on, right? But for the most part, things to write on in a permanent fashion were in short supply. So there is also a well-developed sort of oral tradition of sort of memorizing things and sort of learning through oral means. So you would memorize something that somebody recited to you orally, you would then practice and recite it back to them multiple times to corroborate your understanding of it, and preservation of what you would still call text, but sort of transmitted orally, was incredibly important. It was incredibly important even for the passing on of the Quran. The Quran, based on our understanding of the life of Muhammad, was transmitted primarily orally until its codification and compilation under Uthman. And the only reason that it was compiled into this codex, into a written textual form, was due to the fact that the people, that the companions of Muhammad who had memorized different portions of the Quran, and usually multiple companions had memorized sort of some of the same pieces, were being dispersed further and further away to different parts of the expanding empire, and in some cases were dying in battle or of old age. And so you needed a standard written text compiled so that, these portions of the Quran would not be lost forever, right? And so the importance of oral and written tradition and the sort of the placing of sort of the oral tradition above the written tradition there are a lot of reasons for it. There's a lot of history behind it, but it is part of the reason that we don't have historical texts from the time period that we are focusing on here. And in terms of the archaeological evidence, we've been able to find some things that support the early Islamic, or sort of the narrative we have of early Islam, but many of the things that we could use to corroborate are not really accessible to us. In many cases, for example, the expansion of Mecca in order to accommodate several million people on pilgrimage has resulted in sometimes very old archaeological sites that might have given us more information sort of being, unfortunately, sort of destroyed by virtue of sort of expanding the space by which, in which people perform the pilgrimage. So we have some archaeological records. We have some historical records or written textual records from the sort of later end of the early Islamic period. And then the best way we can go about corroborating the information we have is to look to sources from the non-Muslim or outside of the Muslim tradition. And this is part of what fueled this sort of revisionist perspective that emerged in the 1970s, this questioning of sort of, how can we say anything, how can we verify anything from the early Islamic period if we don't have Muslim sources from this time period? Let's take a look and see what non-Muslim sources have to say. If they don't match up exactly, then the whole project is sort of doomed. We should just, take our ball and go home, right? We do see, and this was certainly the case for Hagerism, written by Petrichor and Michael Cook. They tried to sort of corroborate Islamic history by using non-Muslim sources, and found, for the most part, a lack of corroboration. I think that there was a focus on a lack of corroboration, frankly. And since then, we have found many non-Muslim sources that do match up with parts of Islamic history, but the record is still, in terms of corroboration, inherently spotty. We do not have many sources that went into the Arabian Peninsula and can talk about these things that occurred in the Arabian Peninsula, right? from outside of the Muslim tradition. We mostly have evidence from the conquest period and beyond, when the empire is expanding, when the caliphate is expanding into or up beyond the Arabian Peninsula. So we can corroborate some things by comparing Muslim sources to non-Muslim sources, by comparing Muslim and non-Muslim sources to some archaeological records, mostly also outside of the Arabian Peninsula. But this is very slow work. It is very sort of painstaking. And even if we do find sources that cover the same things and during the same time period, inherently they're not going to say the exact same thing, because they're maybe preoccupied with different questions, different reasons for writing these things down, or for documenting them in one way or another, and different points of view, which are inherently going to result in different records, right?
And in terms of these sources that are from non-Muslims, how early are they? And how is their depiction of Muslims different than the way Muslims depict themselves in later narrative sources?
Right. So the earliest ones we have are quite early. We do have, they're very few and they're very brief, but we have a few sources from the conquest period that describes the Muslims as conquerors and as sort of raiders. And there's a representation of sort of like fear, right? Who are these people coming and taking over our town? And but there's not too much detail, and as I mentioned, there's not any reference to religion at all. There is no, the word Islam or Muslim is just simply not present during this early conquest period. Only after a few decades of sort of regular interaction do we see evidence that non-Muslims in Syria and Egypt and Iraq and other places recognize the Arabs who have left the Arabian Peninsula, who are part of the caliphal administration, recognize them as having a distinct religion, as bringing a lot of different sort of cultural norms and different religious understandings along with them. But we don't see that right away.
Understood. And a potential issue one might see with narrative sources is their depiction of events differently or more positively than they actually were. Now, this same can be said of documentary sources from non-Muslims. What's the methodology that scholars use when they're trying to figure out, what actually happened? Because, there's a bias on both sides. Non-Muslim sources might depict their conquerors in a stranger light than what actually happened, or they could not have. So, what's the methodology that scholars use?
Right. I think many scholars would agree that in some of these early examples or early references to the conquest, there is sort of a misrepresentation of sorts, that these events are being represented as much more sort of terrifying than they actually were, and so there isn't really a consensus among historians today about sort of how you should weigh the evidence that you have, right? Should you inherently assume that one account is being truthful, and wherever different accounts vary from that one account, those other accounts are being disingenuous, or should you consider both of them to be suspect? And if that is the case, then how suspect should you consider each one to be? Do you just throw everything out and just say, there's no way we can ever find this out, or what do you do? And so most historians, I would say, tread very carefully and try to sort of describe the different sources that they have, or sort of consider the different sources that they have, where accounts are corroborated. Of course, that's easy, right? We can't say with total certainty that that is correct, but we can say, this is probably, based on the fact that we have multiple accounts saying roughly the same thing, these are probably the general, the major events that are listed here probably happened. We probably have the general contours of the events, as they transpired. Whereas the details might be harder to discern, right? And I think that is, where a lot of historians sort of stand right now. But I also think, we still have many, many historians who are ready to sort of dismiss either all Muslim sources or all non-Muslim sources as totally fabricated and therefore of no use at all, right? And that usually is the result of a polemical stance, or at least that's my perspective on it. But I think historians do try to be careful, for the most part, in how they go about analyzing these sources. Nobody can be totally free of their own biases, right? And of course, we all have different perspectives on what we're reading and what we're looking at, and we all have different sort of areas of expertise that influence sort of the conclusions we might draw from a particular document or set of documents, or material evidence that we've examined. But ultimately, I do think historians try to be careful, and so the best way to go about this is to sort of weigh the evidence and try to figure out what to do with what you have. Sometimes, I have heard from my mentors that trying to find out what really happened is sort of a fool's errand. And the best you can do is to take a look at your evidence or your sources and see what they can tell you. Maybe you have a source that talks about the events that happened in the year 82 Hijri, right? And you have another source in a different language, from a different religious tradition that also covers that year. And one talks about conquest and the other talks about famine. And what do you do with that? But what you can do with that, maybe you can't confirm exactly how the conquest went, and if there were conquests, because maybe the other source doesn't talk about them at all, and that's strange. But the source that talks about the conquest doesn't mention a famine or a plague at all, whereas the other one is completely preoccupied with that. What you can draw from that is that almost certainly the people in that particular region were terrified, and there was probably quite a lot of chaos, right? We have, for a more concrete example, in the context of the first fitna, right? We understand that Ali was the fourth of the Rashidun caliphs, and much of his caliphate was spent in sort of turmoil, right, in the first fitna. Many of our non-Muslim sources say during that window of his reign, there was no leader of the Muslims at all, and that is mentioned by a number of different non-Muslim sources. And so what that tells us isn't necessarily that there was no leader. It doesn't tell us anything about the fitna itself, what happened during this first fitna. What it does tell us is that there probably weren't formal delegations being sent to rulers outside of the Muslim conquest, or outside of the Muslim caliphate. And it tells us that there wasn't a focus on interacting with foreign leaders. There wasn't a focus on sort of expansion. The conquest essentially stopped during the reign of Ali, right? And so we can find something, we can sort of figure some things out, but it's often not necessarily, quote unquote, what really happened. It's not a clear sort of history. It's usually sort of the implications of what that history describes.
So, Professor, as we are nearing the end, I wanted to ask, what is Sirah and Hadith, and why is there skepticism in regard to them as reliable sources of information?
Okay, so this is a very interesting and, yes, a question that could take quite some time to answer. So the question of sort of hadith and how to analyze them is, well, it's complicated, right? So we know that there are two different components to a hadith, right? There is the isnad, which is the chain of transmission, and ideally the chain of transmission will pass along from, it represents sort of how this report was transmitted, and usually, ideally, from a Muslim perspective, this will go all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, who was either the person in the hadith, right, or the person, reporting it, and then it's passed along through people who can be corroborated by the muhaddithun, by people who are studying these hadiths. It can be confirmed that the people in the chain of transmission were, in the same place at the same time. It is possible for them to have transmitted this hadith, this report, onto the next person, and then from that person onto the person after that, and so on and so forth, right? This is hadith analysis. This is a very long-standing tradition among hadith scholars in Islam. And so, based on how well you can follow that chain of transmission, you assess the validity of that hadith, right, of that report. And so, if somebody is missing in the chain of transmission, then, that might raise questions about its validity. If it doesn't go all the way back to the Prophet, that is something that brings it into question. So you assess its soundness, its potential legitimacy based on that. Western academic scholars, particularly in the 20th century, took a look at this system and said, well, okay, you are examining this chain of transmission. This is a complex analysis, and it is incredibly thorough and methodical. But there are a couple of things that were missing in this methodology, which is to say, you can verify a chain of transmission all you want, but ultimately, many of these hadiths contradict each other. Many of them contain supernatural elements that, if you are looking at things from an academic, which is to say secular, which is, well, maybe not secular, but from a perspective that is not religious, how can you verify a report that contains supernatural elements as true, right? Of course, this is deeply non-religious. And so, and furthermore, just because you can trace a chain of transmission all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad doesn't mean that it is legitimate, because it is quite possible. And several scholars in the 1950s and 1970s, Joseph Schacht and Yunbol in particular, argued that that doesn't mean that a significant number of these reports, these hadiths, were not fabricated. A good fabricator, quote unquote, and I say that in scare quotes, we'll take a look at the hadiths with the best chains of transmission, the most sort of sound, tested, proven chains of transmission, and just take those and apply those to a hadith that says, whatever he may want, right? And so that is where the criticism of hadith studies comes from. On the other hand, often the hadiths are some of our earliest, and if we take this chain of transmission as sound, if we take the matan, the actual sort of content, the information that the report is conveying, if we take that into account, these are some of our earliest sources for Islamic history. The problem is that there is a question about how to weigh them in our sort of historiographical sort of assessment of their validity, of their veracity. And so many scholars, I think a lot of scholars today, take a look at hadith and say, it is difficult for us to confirm whether or not these accounts actually reflect something that happened, whether the matan can actually provide historical data to us. What they can tell us is maybe something about religious ideals and social mores during the early period. Maybe they can tell us about sort of ideal interactions, or sort of esteemed interactions, or things that early Muslims, or not things.
I'm sorry, when you say early Muslims, what time period are you referring to?
Oh, that's a very good question. So for the most part, that is a really good question. I think depending on, we could take a look at hadith, and I think that could be very, very broad. That could go, the idea of sort of taking a look at a hadith and drawing sort of ideas about religious ideals and social norms or social mores from it, I mean, that could extend fairly late into the middle period. And so, I'm going to revise my statement, actually, because I think what it can tell us is we could possibly take a look at some like a hadith, and sort of, it's possible we could work backwards and identify, if we want to assume that it is fabricated, identify when it was fabricated based on the sort of the way that it uses language. We could maybe tie it to the way that language is being used by other writers in maybe the 10th or 11th century. But I think I don't actually like that perspective, because I think that is very cynical. I think hadiths can tell us something about the ideal view of what the early Muslim community was like, and I think that changed over the course of Islamic history. But I think it can tell us about sort of the ideal believer. It can tell us about social norms and sort of how one should behave in society based on sort of taking a hadith, or basically, putting those religious ideals and those social mores and embodying them in a story, basically, about the early Muslim community, about the Prophet and his companions. But frankly, every scholar has a different view, Muslim, non-Muslim, Western, in the Western Academy, in any sort of, or in, any variety of sort of educational context, in any sort of religious context. I think there are different views on what the Hadith and what they can tell us, what a Mutter can tell us, what an Isnad can tell us, and how to interpret those things, right? So I think I will leave it at that.
Understood. And when it comes to Sirah, what are some methodological tools that historians use to figure out what's real and what's not real?
Right. So that is also, the Sirah suffers from the same concerns that I've been talking about, these sort of historiographical concerns. How can we verify the narratives that are being passed on to us? The Sirah in particular, they often have these sort of incomplete chains of transmission, but nonetheless, they are there. They don't take us as far as back as the Prophet often. They don't take us as far forward as the time in which, the Sirah is being written, but they do exist in some accounts, in many accounts, actually. So in terms of the Sirah, we have the same questions of, can we corroborate any of these stories outside of the Muslim tradition? Can we corroborate them with any sort of archaeological evidence? Often the answer is no. We can take a look at, for instance, with Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham's Sirah, we can take a look at sort of how Ibn Hisham edited Ibn Ishaq's text. He, in very few instances, did change some language and the way that a report or a sort of narrative was presented. Usually, though, he did very little. And so we can say that there wasn't too much change between maybe the 740s up to the 820s. But, for the most part, how you view Hadith, for example, is probably not too far from how you view Sirah in terms of its accuracy and your ability to verify it and, how you use it as a historical source. Ultimately, you have to put some trust in these documents if you're going to do Islamic history because, in many cases, they're the only source we have. And that's the case for any sort of, for any history that is not modern history. It is often very difficult to find sources that corroborate one another and that, can be verified beyond, just the single text or the single piece of evidence you might have. Anytime you're doing ancient history, that is even more the case, right? Just because you have one document describing the events of a year, for example, and none others doesn't mean that, you can take that document at face value in any tradition whatsoever, in any historical context whatsoever, without having some sort of other, without having an eyewitness record or without having multiple eyewitness records or archaeological evidence that supports that. We know that Abdul Malik built the Dome of the Rock when he did and, put these mosaic inscriptions on the inside of it that were focused on non-Muslims in particular, that were sort of anti-Trinitarian. And we know that because the Dome of the Rock is still standing, right? With these mosaic inscriptions along the, along the sort of upper areas of the walls. We know all of this. We can corroborate this. So that is something that, is not in question. But ultimately, how historians of any religious tradition, of any sort of affiliation do history depends on the trust that they place in their sources and maybe even the relationship that they have with their sources and how they use them and, to what extent they take them at face value, to what extent they find them suspicious, and to what extent they try to read between the lines, right?
Understood. And to be clear, you had mentioned this before, but I just wanted to make it clear again. We don't have much, well, apart from the narrative sources that describe these events, we don't have evidence of writing or any records from anything like the Muslims when they went to Abyssinia in the time of the Prophet, or from the Jews who were there in Medina, or from the Christians, or from any other groups. We pretty much have no geological or documentary evidence from these groups. Is there a reason that's the case? Have you not excavated enough?
I always think that we have not excavated enough, and that is probably the answer for us lacking corroborating archaeological evidence. And sometimes that is about what people choose to focus their attention on, and sometimes that is about difficulties in going to a particular region or possibly the cost, whether a government will allow you to go to a certain region and excavate, whether that is something you can get funding for from sources for academic funding, whether that's the government or foundations or what have you. Sometimes that even depends on if a place has been excavated or an area has been excavated. Sometimes that depends on when, because archaeological methods have improved significantly over the course of the past century. So sometimes, certainly in areas of modern-day Israel-Palestine, where the focus has been on biblical archaeology, we know that prior to even the 1960s or possibly even the 1990s or later, sometimes in the search for biblical era materials, things from later periods were simply sort of cast aside. So we have no idea what sort of evidence might have existed from, say, the conquest period or the Umayyad period, or even as late as the Ottoman period, right? So it could be a result of that. But I am a strong believer that if we were able to excavate certain areas, we would probably find a lot more archaeological evidence to corroborate some of these historical sources that we have. Right. So I think that the more archaeological work that we are able to do, the more likely we are to find good evidence. In the context of, for example, the Muslims traveling to Abyssinia, we don't have evidence. We don't have any sort of corroborating evidence written in Ge'ez to talk about that particular event. We don't have archaeological records. We do have corroborating evidence.
When you say Ge'ez, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sorry?
When you say Ge'ez, what is that?
Oh, sorry. Ge'ez is Ethiopic. It's the language of Ethiopic.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So we don't have records describing that delegation, that group, that visit to the Negus. We do have, however, corroborating evidence in the form of a stele describing the war between the Himyarites and the Axumites. And I think we might even have evidence of this sort of particular event where this war elephant was brought over to fight against the Yemenis, to fight against the Himyarites. And so often the record that we do have that can corroborate some of these narratives it's spotty. We're missing significant portions of it just due to sort of random circumstance. So my hope is we can do a lot more archaeology, and we are able to do some without, despite political and sort of financial concerns. There's been, in the last 10 years in particular, a significant expansion, a huge expansion of what is called sort of satellite archaeology, in which you find satellite imagery and you can actually look at an area of land and take a look at the ruins emerge. And sometimes you get better views than you would have if you'd gone and excavated it in person. We have a better understanding of sort of these pre-Islamic Arabian desert kites, for example, in which animals are sort of herded into like a walled-off area and then sort of hunted. And we have a better understanding of sort of village structures, very, very ancient villages throughout the Middle East in the Arabian Peninsula, as well as areas of Jordan and Syria. Sometimes places we could go, sometimes places we couldn't. Sometimes things that, are right by even a road system, and because they don't stand out to the sort of naked eye, but you can see them from above, suddenly it becomes very clear that there's a site that could and should be excavated there. So we have seen a lot of significant advancements, but I think that there's still obviously much, 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 much more that could be and should be done.
Understood. And as a historian, how valid do you think the Sirah is in terms of knowing what actually happened? And I know we talked about not trying to find out what actually happened, but as a historian, I mean, how authentic do you think the Sirah is, and how should we approach it? Do we approach it with immense skepticism, or how exactly should we approach this source?
Right. So my position on this has changed over the course of my education in Islamic history. Of course, as somebody who was not raised within the tradition, my perspective is, I've always been taught about Islam and Islamic history from a sort of Western, from an academic perspective, and I recognize that in many ways that is a shortcoming. In other ways, it grants me the freedom to be skeptical in ways, well, not grants me the freedom, but in other ways, if I were a skeptic, this would not be nobody would bat an eye. As it happens, I am inclined to believe that at the bare minimum, the general outlines of the biography of Muhammad are true. There is not really any reason, in my view, to fabricate this out of nothing. Like, why, what is the motivation there? Why would somebody do that? I don't see any reason to view the Sirah as any less legitimate than a non-Muslim source, as any less legitimate than many of the sources we have for other periods in history that come from sources that were written down later, that come from sources that might have had a particular perspective or a particular reason for writing things down, that might have been very polemical. Or might have, been written with an agenda to promote a certain viewpoint. There is no reason to hold the Sirah as more skeptical or as more sort of suspicious than any of these other kinds of sources. In my opinion, because there is an attempt in many of these sort of narratives that are contained, particularly within the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, because there are very, very early attempts of sort of transmission of these stories before that has become standardized, I'm inclined to hold those in higher regard, because you do see an attempt to sort of trace these narratives. Now, have some details maybe been left out or embellished or, slightly edited? I think probably. But I think that at minimum, the sort of general outline of the events of Muhammad's life and the events of the early Islamic period are almost certainly true. It is unfortunate that we do not have corroborating evidence. So that is always, that has to be, I have to say that comes with an asterisk, right? We have to, in order for us to be confident in it, in, the validity of these sources, we have to have outside evidence. That's the case for any sort of historical study. But barring that, to me, the scholars who pass down this information, the people who considered this information important enough to pass on, and of course, it is foundationally important to the early period of Islam and to the sort of Islam's understanding of its own history. I think that the people who passed these narratives along were quite responsible about them, particularly in the context of the Sirah. The Hadiths, I have different views depending on the particular Hadith, right? And that's the case for everybody who studies Hadith. But for the Sirah, I do hold it in relatively high regard. Yeah.
What is Tarikh, and who are some important authors in that genre, and what are some important works in that genre, and how do historians today, who are writing for students in university, how do they utilize those sources when they write their own histories of Islam?
Right. So in terms of Tarikh, scholars, okay, so important scholars in the tradition. The first scholar who is always referenced is Tabari, right? So Tabari was writing in the late 9th century, not late, sometime in the 9th century, maybe early 10th, so 3rd-ish century Hijri. Tabari is used by many historians. He is like the historian that I think he's referenced among English language texts on early Islam. I would say he is referenced more than anyone else. And the reason for that is because his history is like the first history to be translated entirely into English. That is, I think, pretty much it. I think that is the reason that people use him so much.
Okay.
Quite honestly, I mean, he is very early, and he has done his due diligence. His work is excellent. But there are a number of other scholars who also, fit those parameters. We also have the Mutter, Buldan, it's been a morning, the history of the conquest, or the conquest of, the realms or the regions, is an incredible source. We have histories of Mecca. We have histories of Syria. Ibn Asakir, who's a little bit later, wrote a history of the city of Damascus. We have a number of historical sources that I think are neglected in favor of Tabari, sometimes because Tabari is right there, and Tabari is easier to use because he was translated by respected scholars in the field. He was translated from front to end in the 1980s and 1990s. And so scholars just, reach for him first. But I think there are a number of other historians who aren't even often referenced who do just as good a job. Mutter, for example, the sort of history of Egypt is an important one. We have, so many different historians that are often used just by specialists of a particular region or a particular time period, or maybe even more than a particular time period, because Tabari covers the early period. A lot of scholars, historians who write, histories are not used nearly as frequently. And I'm not really sure why that is, but other than sort of the convenience factor. But I think it is a problem in the field.
Understood. Thank you so much. And Professor, well, you went to, arguably one of the top NELC Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations programs, perhaps in the world. And you've worked with, one of the most renowned academics and experts in this field, Professor Fred Donner. Now, what advice do you have for aspiring historians of this period? And are there any works that you would suggest that students pick up?
Okay. So in terms of students who are interested in working in this field, if you're interested in early Islamic history, well, I have a lot of recommendations. The first is learn as much Arabic and or Persian and or Syriac and or Turkish, well, maybe less Turkish if you're doing the early period, but learn your languages and work in those languages where possible. Working with translations, despite it being convenient, can get you into dangerous territory because you're not actually looking at, what a text is saying, and translations can be weird. I would say also, this sort of dovetails with some things I've said earlier, but respect your sources. And when I say respect your sources, don't manipulate them into saying something that you've decided is going to be your conclusion, because you can find any source and manipulate it into saying what you want it to say. If you choose the right sort of quotations and interpret them in particular ways. I think the sources in many times speak for themselves both directly and indirectly. And so while you want to maintain a healthy sort of, not suspicion, but reservation about sort of declaring that source to be true in every possible way or false in every possible way, your sources can tell you quite a lot. And so I think the goal of the historian is to see what the sources are saying without taking them at face value and sort of interpreting around what is just written plain on the page. And then in terms of important text, I think that depends on what sort of subfield you're interested in. So I was interested in conversion from early on. I mentioned Richard Bullitt. I took classes with him at Columbia. But more than anything, I wanted to work with Fred Donner, who studies the early Islamic period and sort of understands it so beautifully. His writing spoke to me sort of in a way that no other scholars did, which is why I wanted to work with him so much. And so I think that is partly because it's so nuanced, and I think partly because I think it is very careful. And so I do like many of Fred Donner's works. I would say for any scholar, if you're interested in doing something similar to that particular scholar, or you like that particular scholar's point of view, read what they have written, but don't take everything at face value, right? So I think, for example, I've talked quite a bit about Fred Donner's Muhammad and the Believers, which was published in 2010, maybe 2011. Many scholars have, not every scholar, not every academic in the field of early Islamic history agrees with all of the conclusions in that book. And in a lot of ways, I have a different opinion as well. But I benefited greatly from reading it. It did change my thinking about the field significantly. And about my understanding of early Islamic history. And so I would say read with a healthy skepticism, but don't immediately jump to conclusions. Let things sort of marinate. Who else would I recommend reading? I'm now staring at my bookshelf. I would say go to the primary sources. Read, if your Arabic's not good enough, start with your Tabari, right? Read your Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham in translation by Guillaume. Once your Arabic is good, read them in the original Arabic. And read your Baladuri, read some hadiths, read, as weird as it sounds, peruse through Bukhari and Muslim and these other, important texts. Read the Quran just to get a feel for sort of what the Quran, how you, and think about it differently, not just as a source of scripture, not just as a source of sort of religious inspiration, and it is, those things and more, right? But read it from an academic perspective and try to sort of train yourself to do that. Which is, again, not to say that you are going to be inherently skeptical of everything that the Quran says or take everything at face value, but sort of, read it and sort of see, well, what is this text telling me? What is it sort of, what can I say about sort of its structure, or it's the way that it sort of uses language, or the way that it describes its own histories, or the way that it connects itself to other religious traditions? What can those things tell us that maybe haven't been said before, that bring us a slightly new and more nuanced understanding of what Islam is and what Islam was, and sort of how different people have interpreted it at different points in time.
Understood. Thank you so much, Professor. Do you have anything in the works right now? Any articles you're writing? Any books or any programs?
Yes, I'm right. Right. So I am writing an article on the Quran and its sort of narrative structure. Actually, when I talk about structure, that's sort of what I've been thinking about lately. And I am developing my dissertation into a book, although that is that is something that will be focused toward the summer. Our semester is just ending here at Bowdoin, and so I've been teaching lots of students about Islam, and I've been teaching students about conversion and sort of what that process looks like. So be on the lookout for an article about the Quran and its narrative structure, and eventually a book about conversion in the early Islamic period, particularly in Syria and Iraq, particularly among Syriac-speaking populations. I should note also that I did talk quite a lot about conquest from a very sort of military perspective, and I hope that the language I used was not too troublesome. In a lot of contexts, I was, I was focusing on conquest more so than on sort of on ideas of expansion and that sort of thing, and less on sort of the development of society. And that's not necessarily the focus I always want to take. I think it is important to look at sort of interactions beyond just sort of a military focus, because that's the early Islamic society wasn't just its army. There was much more going on there, and so I just wanted to make that final note.
Wonderful.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Mutter. You took out a lot of time in your very busy schedule to give us a lot of information, and it was a very, very insightful conversation. And I want to thank you once again for being a guest.
Thank you. I've enjoyed listening to the podcast, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about all of this. So thank you so much for having me on. It was wonderful to talk to you.
You're very welcome.